I think a materialist approach to things is very, very consistent with my experience in Christian social justice.
I feel like the deeper I get into anarchist practice, the deeper my faith is getting at the same time.
I would hope that, securing means of life for all would be something all people of faith would say, oh yes, that's at the basis of what we believe.
And those who are most marginalized know the most about the true, the good, and the beautiful.
To me, it's less that I think building class solidarity is a bad thing, as much as it seems like if you don't attend to things like anti-Black racism, that's always going to get in the way of building class solidarity, actually.
And when you go back, you find that a lot of revolutionary grassroots participatory movements, the precursors to what you could call the barrio assemblies and these grassroots neighborhood organizations, a lot of these were sponsored by the church.
What does it mean to say that the Christian tradition is internally contradictory and there are antagonisms there and you're always being faithful to some aspects and betraying other aspects?
Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm Dean Detloff, a PhD student at the Institute for Christian Studies in Toronto.
And I'm Matt Bernico. I teach media studies at Greenville University in Greenville, Illinois.
This week we're going to do another Socialism 101 episode prompted by some good conversations on Twitter, just talking about some basic terms. What the heck's capitalism? What's socialism? What's communism? Those three specifically we're going to talk about. I think it's a good idea to do a little bit of this, in part because it's important to kind of revisit these basics, and also because Matt's coming here really soon. We don't have time to read a whole book.
Really hard to read a whole book right now. But next week, though, the episode will be live with us in the same room together, so that'll be
live,
good.
But later for you.
Live, it's always live for us, but it'll be more live in that one situation.
More live, double live.
Cool. Before we do that, though, I think we're going to carry on the tradition that we've now started since 100 and taking the questions from the people who really need answers, and those people are from the Christianity subreddit. So, Dean, I think that you've pulled out 3 more really pressing issues we need to address this week. Could you just kind of how about you kind of can set them up, and then I'll spike them into the net of scoring for the Kingdom of God or something.
Yeah, that's good, but don't spike them into the net because we will lose points. Spiking
them over the net into the sand. I don't know how to play volleyball.
That's fine. I only know it because I live by the beach. All right, so first question here. Is it fine to have Halloween decorations inside your house as long as it's not a jack-o'-lantern? And this is posted 24 days ago, so just thinking really far ahead right now.
After Halloween, though.
Or before Halloween. It depends on what side of the year you're thinking about. All right, here's how they expand a bit. I don't celebrate Halloween. Good start. And I remember being taught in church it's not good to have a jack-o'-lantern, but I forgot the reason, to be honest. I know it's not good to dress up during that time as well. Is it fine to have other decorations inside your house, though? I kind of like the purple, orange, and green decorations and the fake ghosts with googly eye decorations. Is it fine to have those up or nothing at all during Halloween? I know this Halloween is far away, but I wanted to be sure ahead of time.
Yeah. Wow, that's a really good question. It's one that I struggle with probably every Halloween as well. So what's wrong with jack-o'-lanterns, though? Like, why are those bad specifically? I mean, the googly eye ghosts obviously are fine, but why the jack-o'-lantern?
Clearly. Yeah, I mean, jack-o'-lanterns are uniquely evil, and that's really the mystery here. They know there is a reason, they just forgot. So they've come for the help.
I appreciate that level of honesty of like, I know they're bad, but I don't remember why. So, okay, I think jack-o'-lantern is okay to have inside your house if it's got a crucifix on it. It can't be on the same wall as your katana still, but if it was a jack-o'-lantern with a crucifix, I think it might be fine.
Yeah, right. Let me think, though. I don't know. There's got to be some historical reason for why you shouldn't have them in your house. I guess I sort of feel like the questioner. There's got to be some reason for this prohibition. The prohibition among all Christians.
You wouldn't want to have a jack-o'-lantern in your house because it'd get all mushy and smelly real quick, you know?
That's true. I don't know though. I think it's important to ask this question because people try to find the unity underneath all the various kinds of Christianities, and I mean there's creeds, there's different ideas about baptism, all that kind of thing that separate us. But the one thing that just unifies every Christian is this very prohibition, I think.
Yeah, that is true. Hey, there's a lot of good. I got a lot of good responses to this, but there's one that's my favorite. It's a little bit down the page, and it just says, "Oh man, we did a podcast series on this. I highly encourage you to give it a listen." And this is a pod. I'm not going to say the name of this podcast because I don't want to advertise somebody else on our show unless they're going to pay us. But it's called the name of the podcast just is "Should Christians Celebrate Halloween?" And they think that it's complicated, something you could do an entire episode on. But there you go.
That's true. But we've only got a couple of minutes. I'm trying to think if we can come up with just one really good reason though.
To not have it, or to have it.
Yeah, to not have it. For sure, definitely not have it.
Did when you were kind of being evangelical, was it important to you not to have Halloween?
In reality, no, it wasn't. But I did have friends who were not allowed to trick or treat.
Really?
In their life.
Man.
Yeah.
That's wild.
It is wild. Huge bummer.
Huge bummer. Where are you going to get candy from? That's the real question.
Houses with jack-o'-lanterns. That's where. All right, here's a question. Is this sorcery or whatever? Now, here's the expansion. I'm probably being a worrier about this, but you know how when you were a kid, you would take someone's hands and tickle every finger, and you would rub them, which one hurt or tickle the most, and they would tell you to think of a star, square, or circle. Then they would rub your finger and you could see the shape. Is that sorcery or witchery or whatever? Or am I just overthinking it?
Okay. So, picture this. You're a kid. And someone... they're rubbing your fingers. An adult, a friend... a classmate, who knows? They're rubbing your fingers. They're giving your fingers that good little tickle. Every single finger. They're not gonna miss even one of them. And you have to tell them which one hurts or tickles the most. And then they're like, okay.
What a spectrum of experience.
Now that we've established which one tickles or hurts the most, I want you to think of a star, a square, or a circle. Okay, but then this person, they're gonna rub your other finger. And then you can see that shape. All right. So okay. It doesn't need to be explained any more than that. We've all had that experience. We got that friend in our life that's going to come and tickle your fingers. Yeah. But the question is it witchcraft, sorcery, or whatever, though? Now, that's the real question behind it. Because you do see the shape and your fingers are hurting. But is it witchcraft?
So has the shape been conjured using the dark arts?
Yeah. I'm going to go out here and say that yes, if they're rubbing your fingers and then you're seeing the shape, that is definitely witchcraft. It's definitely, it's got all the components of a spell.
It does. You got, I guess the reagent here is just the hand itself.
That's right. And then the tickle is the magic. That's how you know that it's happening.
Right. Or the hurting. That's how you know if it's dark or light sorcery or witchery.
That seems to make sense to me.
This also sounds like the PG version of a Saw movie.
How do you tickle someone's fingers is my big question here.
Well, you've got to be good at drawing those shapes, I guess. That's really where it comes down to. I don't know. It's very confusing to me. A star, square, circle. Okay, there is kid lore. There's a weird, mysterious world of kid mythology. And it gets passed down from kid to kid on playgrounds. And this is a true thing. It's like really bizarre. Like I feel like a lot of kids have the same kind of weird rhymes or whatever. And I remember like other kids teaching me, but nobody else. Like just kids telling you stuff.
Did anyone ever do this to you when you were a kid? Is this something that's actually real? It can't be real, right?
Not this in particular, but like things like it for sure. Just weird things. Like, dang, I can't remember this one, but there's one where you like move your hand around in a circle, and you move your other hand around like in the opposite direction of a circle or something, and then you like can't move them. the
Oh,
way
right.
they want to afterwards. I don't know all the ins and outs, but it is sorcery or witchery or whatever. It's the same
you ever
category.
You ever do that thing where like you stand in a doorway and you press your arms on both sides of the doorway really hard, and then your arms just like magically float up?
That is sorcery, obviously.
Clearly, the door spirits get real mad at you for that one.
They get riled right up, and then they rile your arms up.
Okay, cool. What's the next question? I think we've done this one. It's sorcery.
It's sorcery, not witchery, and not whatever. Definitely sorcery.
For sure.
All right, well, we're going to take a dark turn here just for this last one. The question is, should Christians drink Monster Energy drinks? Sounds innocent enough, but just wait. This person says, I could use y'all's advice on this. Do y'all believe? Saying y'all is so bad because I'm from northern Michigan and I obviously... it's not a natural thing for me. Do y'all believe that Monster Energy Drinks is a satanic company, or that Christians should not drink these drinks because of what they represent or stand for? I've heard several different viewpoints and theories on what the meaning is behind the symbol and phrases displayed on the Monster Energy can. Some of which are that the symbol is actually the same symbol, the Hebrew symbol for the number 6, displayed 3 separate times, and that it is actually the devil's number, and that the phrase unleash the beast displayed on the can both have hidden satanic meanings. Conversely, those who do not believe that there is anything below the surface of this claim say that it is just advertising a claw mark for the symbol, and that Unleash the Beast is just a reference to the title of the drink of Monster in general. Well, I'm glad we got the skeptic's view here.
So
I've gone back and
fair
forth.
and balanced reporting right here.
Fair and balanced, no spin zone. I've gone back and forth on the issue over the years, and I'm still on the fence as to what I believe when it comes to this issue. No help from Monster Energy Drink Inc., as they refuse to answer or weigh in on the discussion regarding this topic. So I'm left to refer to fellow Christians. What are y'all's opinions, and what does your heart tell you when it comes to this? So, Matt, I just want you to examine your heart here for a moment.
From my heart perspective, I'm going to go out here and say that, yeah, Monster Energy drinks are probably demonic and you shouldn't drink them. Christians shouldn't. I mean, heathens, go for it, I suppose, but Christians should avoid it.
Or maybe Christians should have Monster Energy drinks because we're the only ones who will never unleash the beast.
Okay, so it's like Christians could drink it, but since because we're saved though, it won't really get us, you know?
Yeah, we'll keep the beast leashed, as it were.
It's like okay, so a regular person, a non-Christian,
a civilian, if you will,
a civilian, not in this raging war between God and the devil. They drink.
Has never even read this Present Darkness.
That's right. They drink this big tall can of monster stuff, and they get possessed by a demon. The beast is unleashed in them, in their hearts and lives.
Yeah, that's right. They have no leash on their beasts, and I think that's actually one reason that Christians might consider drinking it, specifically to keep the beast leashed. For every non-Christian that drinks it, there's a chance that the beast gets unleashed.
So what I hear you saying is that Christians, not only should they drink it, but it is a moral imperative because they're the only people that can keep that beast leashed.
Exactly. And I think that's also why Monster Energy Inc. refuses to answer this question to someone they know who is a Christian. Because they don't want to let that out.
Yeah.
Oh, man, here's a coincidence I didn't even know. The asker of this question is literally named Civilian Has Questions.
Whoa.
That is not a joke.
Hey, do you think that this is why evangelicals do so many lock-ins?
I think that's why.
It's like you got to get the teens to stay up all night, and then you give them this big monster drink, and then they drink it all up so their friends can't.
Just to keep the beast at bay a little bit longer.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Also, this is the premise for my new energy drink. Angel Naptime drinks. Leash the beast.
It's got CBD in it, and it's just for angelic boys to take naps with.
And angelic girls and angelic non-binary people. We're not, we're progressive Christian company here.
Yeah, absolutely.
Church clarity score clear and affirming.
Hang on, I'm gonna Google Christian energy drink really quick.
Oh no. You're about to unleash the beast for sure.
It's so hard because almost all of the search results are about Monster Energy drink.
The first one when I type it in is from Desiring God, and it's just should energy drinks fuel the Christian life?
We need to get back on the Ask a Pastor train, but only ask this question over and over. Hey, I don't think there are any Christian energy drinks out there. What would you name your Christian energy drink?
Oh boy, Pentecost.
Ooh, that's a good one. No, I don't have one, so there you go. That's what it is. John the Baptist Extreme Soda.
Now with locusts.
It's. Yep. Okay, that's what it is.
All right. We have to put this Reddit stuff to bed. Maybe we'll come back to this some other time. But I just felt like these questions were hanging around, and I felt like we should get them out. Episode 100 leftovers.
Yeah, it seems good. I'm glad. I don't know. So the moral of the story is, please, Christians, get out there and drink all of the Monster you can, so your friends don't. So we keep this beast just locked up tight.
Keep that beast locked up tight. That's right.
But you know what beast you're not going to keep locked up tight? The beasts of all of us on Twitter, making wildly different statements about what socialism is.
Oh boy, I'm glad that we finally got around to a really bad segue. It's been a while. We've been doing a good job, and now we're finally back on brand.
Yeah. So I don't know if you all were on Twitter this past week. Hey, maybe you weren't. Maybe you're off Twitter for Lent, and that's good. I hope you stay off
Good
it
job.
forever. One of my favorite Magnificasts, Katie Grimes, asked all of her followers some like really big political questions about like what words even mean, and sometimes people do that, and it's kind of like it can be kind of like frustrating. But Katie is good and smart, and when she does it, it's okay with me, and I like it a lot. But it makes sense though. So Katie is kind of like responding to this thing. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is very popular, and Bernie Sanders is very popular, and people like socialism again. And she's like, okay, but like a lot of the problems with socialism just come up when people don't know what socialism even means, or what capitalism even means, or like why these things are contentious terms. So she just asked all of her followers, what do these words mean? And boy, were there ever a lot of weird ones.
Yeah, there were.
A lot of things about the government doing more things and being more socialist because of it. A lot of a really annoying Marxist like me telling her what the real answer is. And a lot of other people from just in between. So those are the two camps that exist on Twitter. But anyways, Katie Grimes, she asked this question. It seems to me that discussions about socialism are often unproductive because people have wildly different definitions of the term. So, out of curiosity, how do you understand the word socialism? That's a good question.
It is. Yeah.
So
Really
if you,
good one.
yeah, for sure. It's kind of like if we don't know the answer to this, it's kind of this whole show's over. So if you're involved in the online discourse, it seems like Katie's question is actually a good one. Is socialism the workers owning the means of production, or is it when the government does things, and the more the government does, the more socialister it is? To get to the bottom of these questions, it's time for another Socialism 101 episode. You've been waiting since like episode 50 probably for one of these. So in this episode, we'll work through some of the big contentious ideas surrounding how people define terms like socialism, capitalism, and communism, and maybe something else. Who knows?
It could go anywhere at this point. I feel like we should start with capitalism, just because that's the place we find ourselves now, and then maybe we could talk after that about different strategies of how to get someplace else. Does that sound good?
Yeah, it seems really important to actually start with capitalism because, I don't know, socialism is something that we think of in distinction to capitalism. So I guess before we can talk about what socialism is, we probably have to figure out what capitalism is.
Yeah. All right. So I tried my hand at responding to Katie's tweet. Here's what I came up with. So I said, capitalism is a web of property and productive relations, where the means of producing and the value produced by them are privately owned, and labor is sold for a wage. I thought very hard about it while I was sitting on my couch in the morning.
It's a pretty good definition, I think. I'll tell you the things I like about it. I'll be real with you. Capitalism is a web of property relations. That it's like, it's not just like one type of property relations, but it's a bunch of different types kind of grumped together. So there you go. It's more than just like, a factory owner or something, but there's lots of different types of property that people come to own that I think exploit people in very unique ways.
Yeah. I think that's the biggest piece, actually, because a lot of people see capitalism as, or they reduce capitalism to sort of one thing, and that one thing differs depending on who's reducing it, I guess. But the most powerful criticisms of capitalism, I think, are the ones that see it as kind of like an aggregate result of a lot of things at once that kind of keep cooperating, but also mutating and morphing and changing in such a way that certain people stay in power and certain people are not allowed to have collective property or have to sort of be compelled to sell their labor to other people. So we'll talk more about all of that. But I think that's just the big thing, is that capitalism's a lot of things working at the same time, not necessarily working together. Sometimes they're antagonizing one another, but all kind of it's the result of a multitude of things.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. It's also another part of your definition that you gave that I think is essential, is that labor is sold for a wage. That wage labor is like, one of the defining features of capitalism. But even though there's like some forms of labor in the contemporary sort of political economy that are, they are for a wage, but the wage looks different, it still doesn't mean that it still means that it's capitalism, right? Like, even if you're working on I don't know, Amazon's Mechanical Turk or something, and you get paid like less than a minimum wage for these like microtransactions, it's still like the selling of your labor time for a wage.
Yeah. So let's start maybe trying to like work this out and breaking it down a little more by going to my favorite guy who talks about capitalism, that is Karl Marx. So I was revisiting Capital, which is a really long but very fun book to read. That Marx wrote. If you don't know what Capital is, it's a book that he wrote to try to sort of piece together the different parts of capitalism's political economy. And it's in a couple of volumes. The first one is finished, and the other ones are sort of more or less finished. But in any case, in the first volume, it's really fascinating because Marx actually starts talking about capitalism not by saying, hey, here's what capitalism is, but actually by talking about commodities. So the first chapter and the first kind of section is all about what commodities are, how they work, and what they sort of mean in our life in a capitalist economy. I think this is really an interesting, instructive moment, because you might say, like, that's really frustrating because he doesn't just sort of give it to you. But the reason is that he just sort of picks something that's already happening within capitalism and jumps in. He could start in a number of places. So he just kind of like, it's like, well, I'm going to start at commodities and kind of work out from there. And I think the reason for that is that capitalism, like we were just saying, isn't just sort of one thing, but a way of organizing relationships between people and things in such a way that private owners of capital are able to retain and grow the capital that they have at the expense of other people who don't have capital. So that's kind of where I would start anyway, is sort of where Marx starts, which is to say, you can jump into capitalism in a number of ways to try to describe it and how it looks and what it's like to live within it. But the main feature is that you have to sort of understand it as this series of relationships that emerges.
Yeah, and the texture of those relationships are really important too. Not only are those relationships about like our buying and selling, but it's about understanding like how those relationships change the how a worker's life actually looks externally, but also internally. So, Capital is something that Marx wrote towards, the later part of his life. But on the other end of the spectrum, towards the young Marx, he wrote the Philosophical and Economic Manuscripts of 1844. And he talks a lot about in that one about how these specific types of capitalist relationships between like the worker and their product causes workers to feel alienated. And that is kind of a big deal too. So not only is it kind of setting up a distinction between like workers and wages and the production of commodities, but it also has like a real, affective piece about how workers actually feel about their work. In a more like maybe contemporary example, like in Sylvia Federici's Wages for Housework, she points out the ways that domestic labor is ingrained into the gender performance of womanhood while producing the type of domestic life necessary to create workers. And I guess I pull this out and say it because in the ways that capitalism manages relationships between objects and people and people and people, it also hides the type of labor that goes into making those objects. And I think that's something to me that is really important in understanding capitalism, that it thrives off of buying labor power from people and paying them a wage for it. But it also, like, if everyone was kind of just like, if it didn't also kind of erase the labor of those people, I think people, like workers wouldn't put up with it in a lot of ways. So capitalism has these relationships with people, but they have these different types of intensity that hide some of like the really horrible parts of those types of jobs.
Yeah, I think that's right. And maybe one more sort of theoretical piece to draw out from Marx to understand capitalism is just trying to think about the relationship between capitalists as people and a class and the proletariat as people in a class. There are other people and classes in society, but those are the two sort of big ones that Marx and Engels focus on in particular. I think it's actually useful to also talk about that when we talk about capitalism, because that's one of the primary antagonistic relationships is between those two classes. So it helps to understand capitalism as an ism if you can understand the capitalist as an ist, as an individual. So a capitalist is, put simply, I guess, somebody who privately owns capital, owns the means of producing things. So they own a factory, or they own the stuff that allows other stuff to get made. And as a result, they have to, or they buy the labor of people who are part of the proletariat class who do not own that capital to help them continue to grow their own capital. And then when they have to, they sort of pay out some of that capital as wages to their workers. I think that's also just useful because, like, you can get lost in tracing all the different relationships that happen in capitalism. And if you read Capital, for example, it's very easy to get lost in that book because Marx is trying to nail down a lot of moving parts at once. But just put maybe simply, I think you could say that capitalism is about helping capitalists retain and grow their capital, and also about not extending that capital to everybody collectively in an equal way.
Yeah.
Does that seem like a good summary?
Yeah, I think so. The one other quote I wanted to bring up too was from Richard Gilman Opolsky, and I think it just kind of echoes what you said. He has this book called Spectacular Capitalism, and he says in the first just bit of the book, he says about capitalism: however we define capital, the capitalist is in favor of accumulating it, not losing it or taking it away. Capitalism, by its own internal logic, is about the accumulation of capital. So yeah, exactly what you're saying. It's about capitalists retaining wealth and not giving it to other people, because that would be kind of counter the point. I guess what I like about this bit here is that he recognizes that there's like one big rule to capitalism, and that is don't lose the things that you have appropriated from other people. You can't, you don't give it away. That's the rule, is that you're always trying to get more of that thing. And
right.
I mean, it seems like a really basic understanding or really basic tenet of capitalism. But what I think it starts to add to the conversation is that, like, by this like very flexible logic of just accumulating more, capitalism is like a super flexible type of political economy. Like, it always knows how to shove itself into any kind of given situation by asking the question, like, how can I milk this for all it's worth? How can I take all of the money out of this given situation? How can I use this whatever new form of technology or new situation to wring every last cent out of people who might use it? So right. It's helpful to me, at least, to think about capitalism as having like one big internal logic of accumulating capital, and then taking that logic and just jamming it wherever it can fit.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of keying in on a sort of central feature of capitalism for sure. It's tough because what this means is you can try your best to sort of summarize all this in a tweet, like I tried to do, but you always end up sort of losing all these other pieces of it, like the affective piece that you mentioned earlier, Matt, which I think is really important. And I think for a lot of Christians, it's the affective part that actually encourages us to be critical of capitalism first. At least that was the case with me, like, kind of looking around and being like, wow, this system is really making people feel bad. Like, it creates unjust relationships, and people feel the weight of it, and they suffer under it, and like that just seems intuitively not good. And then maybe you go about looking for how to explain that, and you stumble on something like Marxism or a number of other anti-capitalist philosophies to help you explain it. But yeah, I think that you can kind of like come at capitalism in so many different ways, and the important thing is to just kind of key in on some key figures, and what you're just saying about this logic of accumulation is a good one to not lose sight of, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, and speaking like to the, I guess, more of like the Christian angle of this question, like, okay, I 100% understand that there are Christians in this world who don't agree with our exact take on socialism. That's an understatement.
Really?
Yeah, surprising, huh? Wild how that's the case. But like, even if they don't, something that Christians can gain from like reading Marxists and anarchists that do this type of like analysis of capitalism is just like you get to see like a really good description of the world and like what it looks like from this different angle, right? Like, if you're a Christian, you're interested in, you know, the least of these, or people who have been exploited, or people who are in really other types of oppressive situations. Like, if that's kind of a perspective you're interested in, Marxists and anarchists like know how to write about that kind of thing. They like have the methods, and they have the intuition to know where to look for them. So like, if nothing else, even if you like disagree that all property should be like socialized or something, or that you know, even if you agree or disagree with like some of like the more Marxist tenets that we'll talk about later, I suppose, people who like Marxists are really good at describing the world and describing the people like that Christians ought to really care about.
Yeah, I think that's also a good kind of way for us maybe to transition to talking about what socialism is, because there are multiple reactions to capitalism, just like there are multiple interpretations of what it is, or ways to sort of explain how it operates. And I think it's actually really good to have a real conversation about what socialism is or isn't, and also to bring out like perspectives on socialism and what it is or isn't. So, you know, what do people who describe themselves as socialists say socialism is, and then what do people who are not socialists but still on the left or critical of capitalism say that socialism is?
Yeah.
So yeah, maybe like one kind of way to jump into this is to note that, I mean, if you look at the news cycle at all, you can kind of tell that socialism is kind of like a floating signifier, is the way that we might talk about it in philosophy. Like, it's a word that's not really tied to an extremely obvious referent. It seems to mean a lot of things. It doesn't really, like, okay, Bernie Sanders his whole campaign is sort of premised on being a democratic socialist, right? But he still believes in private property, apparently. He doesn't really have any plans, as far as I know, in his platform to sort of socialize, literally, everything, especially like massive industries or whatever. You know, he wants to regulate banks, not socialize banks. But nevertheless, he describes himself as a socialist. So how can we kind of sort this out, Matt? Do you have any initial sort of strategies for thinking through the ambiguity of that term?
Yeah, I think maybe I do. So when Katie Grams asked this very good question, and I said, she says, you know, like, what's socialism? And I say, it's when the workers own the means of production. Because that's the good Marxist answer that they teach you to say at Marxist Sunday school. She fired back a tweet that was like, okay, cool. I mean, I just fired back a tweet in a nice way, because it was nice. Anyway, she said, like, well, what do you think about then the prevalence of, or like confusion around socialism as a term as it is represented by Bernie Sanders or AOC or somebody.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought to myself, well, I guess it's like good, because it's kind of like a nice PR campaign on the one hand, and bad on the other hand, because it like kind of leads to more confusion about like what socialism actually is, and you end up thinking that like well, actually Sweden is very socialist and Cuba isn't, or something. So there's like, right. I think good things and bad things about it, because if Bernie Sanders or AOC or anyone else is all of a sudden very outspokenly socialist, then maybe people will like, you know, get on board and then drift leftward or something. But also maybe not. Anyways, all that to say, like this confusion about like what socialism is, or like the difference between being like a Bernie Sanders type of socialist and being like a, you know, and sorry, I'm trying to say this in a way that's like not just me like being mean. And you know, the difference between a Bernie Sanders type socialist and an actual socialist or something. That's uncharitable, but whatever. I think maybe just has a lot to do with the types of intentions that people have, being in like, you know, with that type of socialism. Like, I know plenty of people who are in the DSA who are like very big Bernie Sanders type people who are like, yeah, like let's get that dude elected and like get Medicare for everyone or whatever. But then they also would be like, and that's, you know, not far enough. We should also enact 1,000 more policies that lean toward the socialization of, you know, private property, like actual socialism. But then there are people who I think would just stop with Medicare for all or something. So I think that to me, it just is about like what types of actual policy do people want to enact? Like when is enough? I think is maybe a question we can think of when it comes to socialism. Like if you can be satisfied with the socialization of like healthcare, maybe you're not as socialist as some other people are.
Right.
So I know that's kind of like a weird and like winding parsing out of those two things, but like on the one hand, I don't really want to say people aren't socialists just because like they don't subscribe to like every specific thing that I would. But on the other hand, socialism does have to mean something. So maybe there's, you know, how far you're willing to go in sort of like a spectrum of like socialism might be a way to start thinking about that.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, like, words are plastic and they change and whatever. But I think it is important to kind of think through, like, what we're really saying when we talk about socialism. I think that there's part of me that wants to say a lot of this sort of boils down to questions about how to get to a kind of communist future. Because even many democratic socialists want a communist future, but they disagree with other communists about how to get there, right? So if you're, I don't know, like, if you're like a Leninist kind of communist, that brand, then you have specific ideas about what the end state of society is and very specific ideas about the strategy to get there. And those rely primarily on revolution, right? It's not just reformist change, it's revolutionary change, rethinking society from the ground up and building it in such a way that leads toward communism. If you're a more democratic socialist in the kind of like old Socialist Party of America sort of way, that's not really what you're thinking about. You're thinking about how to sort of reform the institutions from within gradually over time in such a way that you end up in some kind of more socialist or communist society. There is a way in which they're sort of, you know, they belong to the same sort of family, like they have a kinship together, but they have some very important like family disagreements. So I don't know, I always think of socialism as a tradition. That helps me because just like Christianity is a tradition, it's full of internal contradictions and disagreements and all that kind of thing. And some people you wouldn't really even want to kind of like seat at the same table if you had to like put all that family together at a reunion. But nevertheless, they've still all got some of the same genes.
Yeah, I think that you're right. I like what you said kind of about the, you know, how do you get to sort of like that more like socialist kind of society, like that's kind of a good differentiating, a good thing that might differentiate one type of socialist from another. That makes a lot of sense to me. And you're right, Lenin has a lot of ideas about that, and so does Marx, and so does like most socialists in the history, in that big tradition of socialism. I mean, you know, if you're not a Leninist and you're like a left com or something, like then you have some other weird ideas too about forming councils and like going on strike and lots of other things. So yeah, I think that, I mean, like I don't really identify as a Leninist, but I do think that there's a lot of good ideas in Marxism, Leninism, and I think that we should, I think socialists should use them when they are applicable, just like I think they should use like democratic strategies when they're applicable as well. Because that's like what it means to be actually a good Marxist, is to kind of understand the historical conditions and like fit things in together, you know, when you need to. But still, like recognizing those different types of approaches to like political change, I think are really important in defining what we mean by socialism as a big term.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I guess I should also say, all right, the difference doesn't just stem from the strategy. Like, there are different visions also of what the end would be among socialists and and communists more broadly. But nevertheless, why don't we try to parse a little bit of this out by going back to our the gospel of communism, the Communist Manifesto.
Yeah, for sure.
Any insight there?
Yeah, so much insight. Yeah, so I'll read this quote from the Communist Manifesto I picked out, and it tells us a little bit of something about what Marx thought that transition might look like, and maybe how we can think about socialism in light of that. So in the manifesto, Marx writes, "The proletariat will use its political supremacy to wrest by degree all capital from the bourgeoisie, to centralize all instruments of production in the hands of the state, i.e. of the proletariat organized as ruling class, and to increase the total productive forces as rapidly as possible. Of course, in the beginning, this cannot be effected except by means of despotic inroads on the rights of property and on the conditions of the bourgeois production, by means and measures, therefore, which appear economically insufficient and untenable, but which in the course of movement outstrip themselves, necessitate further inroads upon the old social order, and are unavoidable as means entirely revolutionizing the mode of production." Okay, so Marx has some ideas about like what you should do, or what like socialists should do when they kind of like can take control. And in this example here, I mean, you hear the language that's very clear what Marx has in mind. The proletariat will use its political supremacy to wrest by degree all capital from the bourgeoisie. So it's like the proletariat has to take the means of production from the bourgeoisie. They have to sort of centralize all of those instruments into the hands of the state. So that's the role of the state, is the proletariat takes all of that private property from the bourgeoisie and it centralizes it in the hands of the state, which is going to kind of like work on behalf of the proletariat. And the state should keep trying to appropriate all of the stuff the bourgeoisie is trying to withhold. So for Marx in this one instance here in the manifesto, the role of the state, or like what that communist society should look like, is a kind of like a transitional period or something. There's this other part in Marx that comes after this in the manifesto where Marx talks about like the withering of the state, like after the proletariat has seized control of the state apparatus and can take all of the capital from the bourgeoisie, and they set up society just so that like everything is kind of working towards like social goods, and so that like the proletariat are the ones that actually own the means of production, and they are socialized for the people in society. After that happens, like the actual state apparatus can start to wither away. So it's kind of like it's kind of like an interesting idea that makes sense, right? Like you can't just say, sorry, there's a revolution and now we're doing communism and everyone's going to be okay with it, right? Like, so Marx is very much a realist on this point, where he thinks that there has to be this kind of point in time where the proletariat takes everything and they set everything up, and then they kind of like recede, like the state recedes away. But Marx never wrote down like how long that should be, or what that should look like, or how you know when it's time, or anything else like that, right? So that's like the overview, though, that Marx gives of like what that transitional period looks like, and what that might actually mean for socialists. And like, it's a very different picture of the world than Medicare for all.
That's right.
But like, don't get me wrong, I want Medicare for all. Like that's fine for me right now. I'd take it.
Yeah, but I mean, this is a good way to talk about some of the distinctions that communists in particular have with certain people who call themselves socialists these days, because like from the communist perspective, the state should continue to sort of appropriate things as long as it can, right? Whereas many socialists now, or people who say that they're socialists, are I'm not saying say that they're socialists in a way to be dismissive, just saying like admitting that that's what they call themselves. They want whatever, they want to take like the medical industry and make that a national publicly owned industry, very important and good, but don't necessarily apply that same logic to other domains of society or other industries. Or in other countries that are often held up as sort of democratic socialist countries, like in Scandinavia or something like that, or even Venezuela and other places, it's a similar case there, where they've nationalized or socialized many other industries, notably like the oil industry, especially in Norway and Venezuela in particular, but they haven't nationalized everything else. So communists respond to that situation by sort of hoping for and agitating for the continued deprivatization of all industries, because they assume that capitalism, that logic of accumulation we talked about earlier, is the kind of thing that always will create unjust patterns in a society, no matter which industry is operating by that logic.
Yeah, that sounds right to me. I don't know. So if you're a socialist in this Marxist kind of way that we just talked about, you're always kind of demanding more, right? Like there's always more that can be done. And I think that's a really, it's kind of an interesting idea because it sets up socialists in this like Marxist sense to be like very whiny, like keep on giving us your stuff, keep on giving us all your cheeseburgers.
Tucker Carlson is right.
Yeah, Tucker Carlson.
Whiny. The whiny left.
But anyways, I think like, so Marx is talking about this here, and here's another good quote that kind of paints the picture a little bit more too, that will draw out some even further distinctions. So the Communist Manifesto, I don't know if you don't know, is written by Marx and Engels, but like mostly Marx. But Engels wrote this other essay called Origins of the Family, Private Property, and the State. And in that essay, he says this about this transitional period in like socialism. He says, the society which organizes production anew on the basis of free and equal association of the producers will put the whole state machinery where it will then belong, into the Museum of Antiquities, next to the spinning wheel and the bronze axe. So, like, I guess what's interesting to me about these things is that, like, on the one hand, like, you could read, you could get a very, like, sort of Leninist reading from these things that, like, yeah, I mean, the state exists to keep, so that it keeps appropriating private property from the bourgeoisie wherever it kind of presents itself. But like the left-com reading of these things is like, yeah, and then at some point the state goes away because it's bad and we don't need it anymore. And those two distinctions are really more interesting to me than I think like democratic socialism or something.
Yeah, I agree. Well, since you brought it up,
yeah,
let me bring out that good Leninist take.
Yeah, do it. Get it.
Yeah, so Lenin's State and Revolution, which we've talked about or mentioned a little bit on the show before when we talked about the Goethe program in the past, I think lends us some more insight here. So the State and Revolution piece is kind of like a long commentary on the Goethe program and some other stuff, but it's specifically dealing with the themes of a societal state and revolution. How do you put these two things together, think of them together? And I think what's really fascinating about Lenin's approach here is that he tries to sort out this what we've been calling this kind of transitional period, the state-sponsored communism. He tries to sort that out in its relationship to the longer trajectory of the withering away of the state itself. So Lenin too, he wants to be an orthodox Marxist. He wants to admit that Marx is right on that the state should wither away. But the way it happens, Lenin thinks people often kind of miss what Marx has to say. And I really like it because, I mean, Marx and Engels are not really dealing with the distinction between communists and socialists in the way that we do today. They did deal with it kind of a little bit, but like the situation was a lot different. I think Lenin is a lot closer to us and helps us answer it. So in State and Revolution, he says this. So in the first phase of communist society, which is usually called socialism, bourgeois law is not abolished in its entirety, but only in part, only in proportion to the economic revolution so far attained, that is only in respect to the means of production. Bourgeois law recognizes them as the private property of individuals. Socialism converts them into common property. To that extent, and to that extent alone, bourgeois law disappears. So let me kind of contextualize this a little bit. What Lenin is saying is that in the Goethe program in Marx, he thinks that you can sort of find two phases of communist society. And he's not just like making that up, like Marx talks about that as well. And the first phase is the one that people nowadays sort of refer more to as socialism. The second phase is the one that's more kind of thought about as communism proper. So Lenin is wanting to actually kind of drive this distinction home a little bit to sort of create some distance. So maybe I'll just read one more quote from the Goethe program to kind of contextualize this. We can talk about it a little bit more. So talking about that first phase, Marx says this: What we have to deal with here is a communist society not as it has developed on its own foundations, but on the contrary, just as it emerges from capitalist society, which is thus in every respect, economically, morally, and intellectually, still stamped with the birthmarks of the old society from whose womb it emerges. And I think that idea of this kind of social society still being stamped by the birthmarks of this old society, that is what Lenin is saying people refer to as socialism. This thing that still retains a lot of capitalist structures, capitalist ways of thinking about things, and Lenin actually wants to sort of affirm that as a momentary phase, but says we should keep on moving to the second phase, what Marx calls the higher phase of communism. Anything in there strike you, Matt?
Yeah, for sure, a ton actually. Something I was just thinking in the left com side of my brain for a minute. I was thinking like, yeah, but like Lenin, well, in the Soviet Union, it sure did last a pretty long time, like this transitional stage. But then I kind of caught this other piece in what Lenin said, and it kind of makes some sense. So in that quote you just read, it says that bourgeois law is not abolished in its entirety, but only in part, only in proportion to the economic revolution so far attained. Which I think that little bit there gives you the kind of like difference in scope in which revolutions actually happen. So, you know, like the revolution isn't over when like the Civil War ends or something, or like when Lenin is in power and like the provisional government isn't. Like the revolution like keeps on going because it's constantly having to struggle against, you know, the hegemony of capitalism encroaching upon it. So this like, I don't know, it's kind of hard. It's kind of hard to think about a type of socialism or a revolution that doesn't have to defend itself in this way or like structure itself in this kind of like phase kind of way. So I think that's I don't know, it's worth thinking about.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, I don't have a very big left com part of my brain, but it's a fair worry. It's a fair worry to kind of wonder what happens to the state given the history of the Soviet Union.
Yeah. Well, it's a fair worry because like there are some like very good like sort of like left com examples you can look to, like I mean like, you know, the Paris Commune or something. Like what happens when they didn't seize the state apparatus and they just kind of like were cool having the commune, like they got steamrolled. But then like there are other situations though where like left communists have been able to kind of deal with this question of like the ongoing revolution in a lot of different ways. Like the Zapatistas, like they were willing to throw down and fight, and they did, and like, you know, they still have to kind of struggle for their the continuation of the revolution in different ways. So it seems like Lenin's right. I'll go on record and I'll say it right here and now.
All right, I'm gonna start that one later. Well, maybe we could talk a little bit more too about the distinction between communism and socialism a little bit as well. So if we could draw a map here of where we've gone in the episode so far, we were talking about capitalism, then we sort of started talking about socialism as or different strategies of socialism responding to capitalism, and now I think we can sort of maybe talk about how communism views socialism a little bit more. And I want to take one more quote from Lenin's State and Revolution, and I promise I won't quote it anymore. But I think this is a really good way of laying it out. So he says, the scientific distinction between socialism and communism is clear. What's usually called socialism was termed by Marx the first or lower phase of communist society. Insofar as the means of production become common property, the word communism is also applicable here, providing we do not forget that it's not complete communism. The great significance of Marx's explanations is that here, too, he consistently applies materialist dialectics, the theory of development, and regards communism as something which develops out of capitalism. Instead of scholastically invented, concocted definitions and fruitless disputes over words like what is socialism, what is communism, sorry, Lenin, Marx gives an analysis of what might be called the stages of the economic maturity of communism. So what Lenin is saying here is we shouldn't kind of get bogged down by debates about like what's truly socialist or truly communist, but instead see these things as part of the trajectory and history of communism. So the kind of Leninist way of looking at these things is, instead of saying that, let's say, a place like Cuba is socialist and not really communist because there's still a significant state in Cuba, Lenin is saying, well, it's still a communist state because it understands itself as being the first phase of communism. which is to say it's trying to build a world in which it could transition to the second phase of communism. It just isn't reasonable to assume that that could happen right now for a number of genuinely good reasons. And I think that's actually a really useful way of looking at this, because if you look at, say, a place like Norway or something like that, it maybe makes more sense to call that a socialist state or a state on the way to socialism or inflected by socialism or whatever, but not to call it a communist state, because it doesn't really have an interest in moving in a communist direction.
Right. Given the historical conditions, if they change so far as they could be a communist country, they wouldn't.
Yeah, exactly. So I don't know. That's the last quote I'll introduce from Lenin to help us out here, but I think it's a really good way of kind of at least splitting one more very important hair.
Yeah, it's a super important hair to split. One big hair. one historically significant size hair. Well, on that same point, I guess, I think what I like about that quote from Lenin that makes it make a lot of sense to me is that the idea that, okay, a communist state doesn't mean that they've achieved communism in some way, right? Because that's not how communism works. It gives us this understanding that communism is a bigger idea than any given one country, even if it is Cuba. So that makes me think of this other quote from the German Ideology, which is a thing from Marx, and he says some good stuff there. So the German Ideology, if you've never read it, I wouldn't really suggest it. If you're a philosophy person, it's very fun. It's mostly him dunking on Hegel, which is awesome. I love that. He dunks on Hegel, and then he invents sociology. So that's what the cool thing about it is. Anyways, there's a part later in the German Ideology where he talks about communism and what it is, and I think it jives with a lot of what Lenin says in the quote from that Dean just read. So Marx says, "Communism is for us not a state of affairs which is to be established, an ideal to which reality will have to adjust itself. We call communism the real movement which abolishes the present state of things. The conditions of this movement result from the premises now in existence." So, just like you were saying, Dean, Cuba is not a communist country because because they did communism. It's a communist country because it's kind of setting up to be in that trajectory of communism. And just like what Marx was saying here too, communism isn't something that you just obtain or you establish or something, but it's the movement that abolishes the present state of things. It's this larger historical understanding that is way bigger than just now or or the moment from the moment a revolution happens to when a party takes power. It's bigger than those things. It's the that big arc of history that moves in a direction.
Yeah, I think that's good. And it helps too to kind of understand even the sort of negative or eschatological impulse that you pulled out in that quote.
Yeah.
Communism, abolishes the present state of things. That's exactly what Cuba is doing. If you understand, first of all, the present state of things being the Batista regime, but even now the present state of things that's in Cuba, communism is still trying to abolish that, right? It's moving into a different kind of future that doesn't include being beset by imperialism or something like that.
Yeah, and I wonder, this might be overstating it or something, but maybe not. I don't know. It seems like there is a type of unity behind this type of communism, or understanding, okay. So in the last episode, Sargon was talking about communists or whatever, and then I was we are communists, so okay, right? And there's a difference between calling yourself a communist and being calling yourself a socialist, and I think that in communism there's a sense of unity in which all of these different types of communist projects are kind of helping in abolishing that present state of things.
Right.
If you're a Leninist and you're a communist, you have a different idea maybe of what some of those things, the importance of some of those things, than if you were a left com or something and you were the Zapatistas have it exactly right. But regardless of those differences, they both are working to abolish the present state of things. So it seems like there is some type of, if you want to say that you're a communist, right, there's a sense of unity that underlies that, in which even if all of these projects you don't exactly agree with them, or you think that they could have done things differently, or you don't like a part of it or whatever, fine, you should be critically in support of things though. Then there's this underlying sense of unity where all of these things are contributing towards the abolition of the present state of things.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. That actually, it's funny you say that. I don't know. I was just thinking about that question this week, and I feel like you answered it for me, so that's good.
You're welcome.
Yeah, thank you.
I mean, people should just be communists. They should stop being socialists. Like, what's the point? Because, like,
yeah. Well, let me ask you to say more about that. Like, why? Why should someone be a communist and not a socialist?
It's the same reason that someone should be like a Christian and not a Baptist. Like, because like Baptism, like like I'm a Baptist. Like that's like small potatoes, man. Like Christians are about like the salvation of the universe and like defeating death and like all kinds of other stuff. And like socialism is about like Medicare for all, but communism is about the abolition of reality in like a better, different type of world, right? Like it seems like the scope of those types of projects are way different.
Dang, I didn't know you were so non-denominational.
Shots fired at Baptists right now. A real non-denominational communist over here, though.
Non-denom-com. It's funny you say that because Althusser, the French communist theorist, he famously said that communism is Catholicism because Catholicism is the word for universality.
Yeah.
And I think that's actually a really neat way of looking at it. Yeah,
I feel like I might mean something a little bit different than Althusser does. I remember like in episode 100 when I was just like, hey, everything's cool, you should be nice to your mom.
Yeah.
It's a different quality of universality than maybe what Althusser has in mind, but still, I'm fine with
it. Could be, but I think he's trying to be playful with that idea of Catholicity, right?
Yeah.
That, like, this is the kind of thing that's supposed to be universal, whether or not it always is, or something like that. Which is what like the Catholic Church says, right? That's why it's called that. The one apostolic Catholic Church is supposed to be the universal church, which is why it's the one church. It's just kind of this weird irony, I guess, and obviously doesn't always achieve that since there are so many dang versions of Christianity. But I think what you're saying about like we should be a Christian and not just a Baptist is kind of the spirit of that idea in Althusser. Is that there's a kind of deeper meaning here beyond just the sectarian disputes or something.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, like the sectarian disputes are important. Like I don't think it's worth downplaying those things. Like, yeah. You know, like leftist infighting isn't all bad because sometimes people are wrong and they need to know they're wrong. But like at the same time, you know, it's how things get worked out. Like in that type of discourse, like you have to have those types of disputes to abolish stuff, man. It's dialectics. God.
Man, this is Lenin is right. It's dialectics. You're like the most. This is your most orthodox Marxist episode, I think, so far.
But also go to church, though.
That's right. All right. Well, let me ask you to say a little bit more about this, and then we can close in a second here. But thinking all the way back to what you were saying about capitalism earlier.
Yeah.
When we think about the difference between why be a communist instead of a socialist in light of the problem of capitalism, even if we sort of struggled to find like a really obvious way of pulling that into like a simple definition, why should one be a communist and not a socialist given the problems of capitalism itself?
I don't know why.
All right, I'll give it a try. Well, I think because that idea that Marx talks about in the Gotha program where that first phase of communism, or what you could call socialism, Lenin doesn't want to, but you could. That first phase is stamped by all the birthmarks of capitalism, right? That's what Marx says. And I think the idea is like you shouldn't really be content with that. Like the birthmarks of capitalism are bad. They're the kinds of things that continue to create problems in your society because they carry on the antagonisms that produced an unjust society in the first place. I mean, this is one way that people have read the crisis in Venezuela. There are many, many, many reasons for it, and most of them are, I think, reducible to imperialism is very bad. But also, like, there are issues in Venezuela around certain industries that were not nationalized or where private capital has actively subverted the socialist project, like in food production, for example. Mm-hmm. And, you know, this is something that communists would point to and say, well, it's not to say that the Venezuelan project is bad or anything, but just to say that the socialist side of it, you can sort of see the cracks in the system, because capital will always be able to subvert those kinds of projects. Because especially if you're a private food producer and you just refuse to make food, you go on what's called a capital strike, where capital just won't make anything. Well, not having food is a pretty big problem that will turn people against socialism, wrongly, but that's what will happen. And it was what is happening. So I think, for me anyway, being a communist instead of a socialist is important, because it helps to name the antagonisms that should not be allowed to persist in society. It isn't willing to settle with leaving some of those antagonisms in place, like modestly reformed.
Yeah, that is a very good answer. Well, okay, so also going back to something, a quote I read earlier, the Richard Gilman-Opolsky one, right? Recognizing that capitalism isn't only a political economy, but it is a logic that kind of is pervasive.
Right.
Seems like a huge part of that insight from Lenin. It's like, I don't know, like that Zizek, Frederick Jameson, whoever thing, where it's like, you can imagine the end of the world before you can imagine the end of capitalism. It's like, right. It's worth being a communist to completely like change the way people think.
Right. Exactly.
Otherwise, you could have a socialist kind of economy, or you could have sort of more like socialist types of policies or whatever, but still it wouldn't sort of defeat the capitalist way of thinking about the world.
Yeah, exactly.
But okay, and this is okay. Here's a wild thing that might be bad to say, but who knows? I think that like for me at least, the idea of being like, that's why you should be a communist over a socialist is also, I think, why it's really important for me to be a Christian too, because like it's there's a lot of things. If you read Jesus a really particular way with a very particular hermeneutic, the one that we've talked about in the show before, like you also kind of see different ways to think about the world than other than like accumulation too, Like Jesus is a person who's not interested in that part of it. It's an example of someone who's doing something radically different in society, lifting up people who the logic of accumulation would cast off to the side. So I think that communism is a good way of getting around like that mental block of like the birthmarks of capitalism. But I think Christianity, like, again, read through this particular hermeneutic, does some of that same work.
Yeah, I think that's totally right. I mean, it's both of these things, both communism and Christianity, are a training in your imagination, right?
Yeah.
Nobody has ever lived in a communist society the way that people like Marx and Lenin envision it. A post-industrial communism is not a thing that has ever been on the planet. But you have ways of thinking about it and trying to get there. And it's the same, I think, with Christianity, imagining a world where, it's the kingdom of God and there's no churches left anymore and everybody's just kind of like figured it out. That's something that nobody has ever lived in either, but something that hopefully we can imagine and strive toward. I think that's really helpful to see it as a sort of training in your imaginative capacity or something.
Yep.
Man, communism gets me pumped. It gets me excited, I feel like.
It's so good. It's so good to be a communist, though.
You can take that to the bank. Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. If you like what you heard, you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/themagnificast. We've also got some new-ish stickers up at Redbubble. Just search the Magnificast there. You can see a few of them. We got a Bear That Fruit sticker hanging out now, along with a bunch of other ones. Let's see what else. You can find us on Twitter at the Magnificast. You can email us at themagnificast@gmail.com. As always, our music is by Amore Armstrong and the Illogical Spoon. See you next week.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord.